accidentally deleted my cold open. And I even quoted Logan Nine Fingers. Hey everyone, so a couple months ago I finished The Wisdom of Crowds, the last book in the Age of Madness trilogy by Joe Abercrombie, which means I've read everything by Mr. Abercrombie. It's kind of bittersweet because he has become an auto-buy author for me. He's a top 5, maybe even a top 3 author of all time for me, and I really enjoy his work. The two biggest reasons that I love Joe Abercrombie as an author, number one is his characters, which you hear everybody talk about. But for me, my number one reason I love him most is not the characters, but just his very unique and distinct narrative voice. It was that narrative voice that just hooked me from the start when I was reading The Blade itself, the first book of the First Law trilogy. So I do want to give a shout out to Mike at Mike's Book Reviews, because I don't know if Abercrombie would have been an author that I prioritized were it not for him just continually singing his praises over on his channel. So thank you, Mike. This rating wouldn't be possible without your influence, I think. So you are going to disagree with me, because anytime we rank works of art, we have things that we like and things that we don't like. This is a very subjective list. But just a quick disclaimer before I start the ranking. 12 of these 13 books I consider at least 4 stars. In fact, I think the top 8 are 5-star reads for me. So when your favorite is 6th, 8th, 10th, something like that, it doesn't mean that I don't like it. It just means that subjectively I didn't like it as much as some others. And the ones that I feel might be a little bit more controversial, I will talk about those a little bit more and tell you what worked for me or what didn't work for me. Additionally, if you've not read these books, this will be 100% spoiler-free, so hopefully I will tell you some things about them that make you want to pick up Joe Abercrombie, and I can do for you what Mike did for me and introduce me to an author that I certainly love. So for those of you that don't know the scope of Abercrombie's works, I want to start with a very quick overview so that you know exactly what I'm talking about in the bulk of this video. Abercrombie started his books with a trilogy called the First Law trilogy, and those 3 books are The Blade itself, Before They Are Hanged, and Last Argument of Kings. He then followed up that trilogy with 3 standalone novels in the same universe that share some of the characters but do function as standalones. Those 3 standalones are Best Served Cold, The Heroes, and Red Country. He then published a book of short fiction set in the First Law universe that, again, uses some of these characters but introduces us to a few new ones as well. That short story collection is called Sharp Ends. Abercrombie then deviated from the First Law universe, and he wrote a trilogy called the Shattered Sea trilogy, which was a very different kind of trilogy, a very different point of departure for Abercrombie. Those 3 books are Half a King, Half the World, and Half a War. For the final 3 books that he has published as to the time that I am filming this video is the Age of Madness trilogy, which is set back in the world of the First Law, 1 generation removed from the First Law trilogy. We get characters that are in common, but we get a new generation of characters, some of them who are the offspring of characters from the first trilogy. Those 3 books are A Little Hatred,
The Trouble with Peace,
and The Wisdom of Crowds. Okay, so now that you have an overview of those 13 books, let's go ahead and get started with my ranking, starting with number 13. 13, Half a War. So Half a War is the conclusion of the Shattered Sea trilogy. And it wasn't so much that this trilogy ended poorly. There's actually a moment at the end of this trilogy where I said, aha, this is an Abercrombie book. Because this trilogy feels very different from everything else he's written. Everything else he has written is very character-centric. In fact, when a plot turn happens in a Joe Abercrombie book, it's usually a convention of character, how a character's motivations influence a plot. And I find that fascinating. It's one of the things I love about him. This trilogy, not so much. This trilogy is more plot-focused. In this 3rd book, we get 3 point-of-view characters, and therein lies my problem with this book, and the reason I rank it last is that I didn't like 2 of the 3 characters. One of those point-of-view characters did have a very satisfying character arc, but the other one just frankly was maybe the dullest point-of-view character I've read in any of Joe's works. So because of that, number 13 is Half a War. Number 12, Half a King. Now, just because I'm starting this list with 2 of the 3 books from the Shattered Sea trilogy doesn't mean that I'm telling you that this is a skippable trilogy. This is still Joe Abercrombie, and I still think it's worth your time. Additionally, you could read these 3 books of this trilogy in about the same time as one First Law book. They are very quick reads, and I think that even though they might not be as good as the ones in the First Law universe, I think there's still some merit to reading them. Half a King, the reason this is ranked 12th and kind of low in this ranking is that it's kind of predictable, especially the first half of the book. The second half, it feels more Abercrombie-esque because there are some turns that you don't see coming, but it does start very predictably. It's also a bit jarring when you've read, for me up to this point, I had read 10 works by Abercrombie, and this is the first time that we have a one point of view character for the whole book. It felt so different from what he had written before. So I don't think these books are skippable, but Half a King is definitely lower on this list in comparison to everything else above it. Number 11, A Little Hatred. So don't get me wrong, this first book of the Age of Madness trilogy is very strong. It's a 4, maybe even 4.5 star book for me. But for me, the reason this is so low is the setting. And you may ask, well, it's the same setting as the First Law. It's all the same setting. Well, in this Age of Madness trilogy, what we are seeing in this world is a rise of industry. So this magical world is starting to go through an industrial revolution. And that's where I struggled to connect with the setting. Ever since I was a kid, I remember so clearly when I was in class, social studies, history class, multiple times in my life, as soon as my teacher would start talking about the Industrial Revolution, my eyes would glaze over and I would just rather be somewhere else. I don't know what it is that I do not connect with that era at all, but if you had me pick out of every era in the history of humanity, my least favorite thing to talk about, it would be the Industrial Revolution. It just does not spark my imagination, and I just don't like it as a setting. So finding my First Law universe that I love turned into an Industrial Revolution, it was tough at times. So just like those times when I was in class and my teacher was talking about the Industrial Revolution, there were times in this book where I was reading and I wanted to be somewhere else. And I know that's a personal experience for me compared to some of you, but that's frankly how I felt because we had discussions of this new technology. We had scenes in factories and warehouses, and I just wanted to get through all of it. Luckily, the final 2 books of the trilogy doesn't have so much of that, because in this book, Abercrombie had to establish the setting, and once it was established, didn't have to dwell on it so much, and it didn't bother me the last 2 books of the series, which I'm not going to talk about for quite some time on this list, because they're very strong. But as a whole, I didn't like the industrial aspects of the setting. However, I did love what it did for the social context of this storyline. The social upheavals that it was kind of causing the unrest because these new technologies are putting people out of work. That part of it was superbly done and is great. But as a whole, A Little Hatred is number 11 for me. Number 10, The Heroes. Now, nobody tell Ed Gwynn. Well, actually, I'll probably tag him anyway because this is his favorite First Law book. This may be your favorite First Law book. I'll tell you why it's so low for me and is the lowest of the standalones, and that is this is a 500-page work that is a 3-day battle. And for me, military fantasy is my least favorite subgenre of fantasy. Now, if it's your favorite, like Ed's, and you love war stories and things like that, this may be your favorite First Law book or a top 3. And we'll agree to disagree about how we like it, but I won't disagree with you to tell you it's not well written. It's superbly done. Such a well-written book. In fact, the scenes, the very cinematic way that Abercrombie shows these battles, it's brilliant. He does this really cool thing that you're in one point of view character's head until they get killed. And then immediately you pick up the scene from the person that killed them until they get killed. And then you pick up in the next character's point of view. And it's brilliantly done. And it actually showcases how great Abercrombie is a character because some of these characters got about 1.5 pages of point of view, and I felt them on a more fundamental level than some authors do in entire novels. So that was superbly done. But as someone who's not a fan of this subgenre, I find this book kind of forgettable. I remember some scenes between characters, but as a whole, I couldn't really tell you a lot about this book, whereas First Law books and the other standalones, I could probably give you a beat-by-beat plot summary. Number 9, Red Country. So I'm always curious to talk to people about their favorite standalone or their order of their standalones. So I'd love for you to put that in the comments below, because I see such a difference in everybody's favorite, everybody's least favorite. But I would say probably the average reader puts Red Country last and not the heroes last like I did. The reason that Red Country is a little bit ahead of the heroes for me is I do remember a lot of it more. And I like the story a little bit better. It's a revenge tale. I love revenge tales. You can see up here, Count of Monte Cristo was my best book I read last year. I'm a sucker for a great revenge tale. This also has my favorite character, one of my favorite characters from the First Law universe, Lamb. And it's a Western. I like Westerns a little bit more than war stories. So that's the reason I rank it a little higher. But I'd love to see your rankings of the standalones now that you know mine. Of course, I'll talk about my top standalone in a little bit on this list. Number 8, Sharp Ends. Now, I know a lot of you are going to disagree with this one because this is a short story collection. But let's talk about short stories a second. I never thought I read a lot of short story collections until a viewer called me on it earlier this year when I reviewed about my 5th short story collection in about 3 months. Turns out I do read a lot of short story collections. I went back to my shelf and I counted like 30 of them. And I'll tell you, this is one of the most consistent short story collections I've ever read. I gave this 5 stars, and as I'm filming this, I think I've read 105 books this year. This is probably a top 10 book for me at this point. Sharp Ends is brilliant. It takes characters from the First Law. It spans the timeline of before the initial trilogy all the way up through the standalones. You get 3 or 4 tales from some new characters that are very compelling. It's fantastic. I don't know why people are so low on this. Granted, I personally, I always would gravitate towards a novel more than a short story collection, but this is one damn good short story collection. Number 7, Half the World. So if you thought I forgot about this last installment in the Shattered Sea trilogy, it's ranked a lot higher than I think a lot of you would tend to expect. The biggest reason is this has 2 point-of-view characters who were my 2 favorite characters in the entire trilogy. So having the entire book from their perspective was fantastic. Additionally, this book has my 2 favorite fantasy tropes of all time, the fellowship trope and the quest trope. I love both of those tropes so much, and that's what this book was all about. Additionally, there were some very cool secondary characters that I enjoyed. There's some scenes of one of the characters who is learning from a mentor. I'm always a sucker for that. So this has a lot of favorite things that I love about fantasy. Now, of course, it's Abercrombie, so they're not done how they're normally done, and they're very unique in many cases, but overall, I really enjoyed Half the World. If anything, this book is the reason why I think you should read the Shattered Sea trilogy. Number 6, The Blade Itself. Abercrombie's debut is awesome. I was so impressed with, as I mentioned at the very beginning of this video, his narrative voice is just so unique, and I just loved it from the start. Now, if you've not read any of these Abercrombie books, this of course is where you start. But you need to go in with the right expectations. Do not go in and think that this is going to have some big, normal type of storytelling where you have a plot that goes here, 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 because it doesn't do that. In many ways, The Blade itself feels like a middle book of a trilogy because there's not really a plot going on here. If Sandan Glokta were sitting here and he strapped me to his torture chair and told me to explain the plot to you, I don't know if I could, because there's not really a plot here, and it's still brilliant. It's still number 6 on this list. The reason is he shows you this world that's so amazing. He introduces these characters. I mentioned Glokta, one of the best fantasy characters, if not one of the best literary characters I've ever read. The introduction to Logan Ninefingers is worth the price of admission. It's one of the most memorable beginnings of a character's journey that I've ever seen. So the scene is just incredible. The Blade itself is great, but don't go in expecting a typical fantasy story, because Abercrombie, again, his narrative voice was set from the very first sentence, where he shows you that he's going to tell these stories a little bit different. It's not going to be what you expect, but it's going to be unique and it's going to be brilliant. Number 5, Best Served Cold. So Best Served Cold obviously is my favorite of the standalones. The biggest reason is I love a good revenge tale, and this is a great one. I always am interested what people think about this one, because this is a very divisive book as well. I think even with the heroes, I ranked it low, but I still appreciate it and think it's brilliant. I've seen people that are like me when they talk about Best Served Cold, that not only is it the best of the standalone, it's one of the finest standalones in the fantasy genre, and I believe that. And then I see people give it a 2 out of 5. So I'm not sure why there's a split reception on this book, because I think it's brilliant. I love the kind of stylized way that he tells this story. It's kind of cinematic. It very much reminds me of Kill Bill, Quentin Tarantino's film, because you get a woman who is wronged in the opening pages of the book. She then wants to get revenge, and she comes up with a kill list, and it's structured like that as she goes after number 1 on the list, and then number 2 on the list, and number 3 on the list, and people didn't like that. I thought it was brilliant. I enjoyed it. I've heard people talk about they don't like Monza as a character, and I just gotta say, stop calling female characters unlikable, because you never call male characters unlikable. I will say that she is humorless, and I wouldn't say that I like her as a main character either. But if you think about a good revenge tale, it's rare that you're going to like the character, because they're kind of in a dark place. Even Count of Monte Cristo that I mentioned, that book, he was in a dark place because how he was wronged and how he had to enact his revenge. Same thing here. So I want to push back on that unlikable term for Monza, but I thought this was a really well-told tale. It's got Casca, which we all love Casca. You know, Shivers always seems to show up, and I just love Best Served Cold. And if you don't, let me know why. We can discuss it civilly, of course, but I love Best Served Cold. Okay, on to the top 4, my Mount Rushmore of Joe Abercrombie books. Number 4, The Wisdom of Crowds. The conclusion of the Age of Madness trilogy is brilliant. It is so good. The ending of this book, there's a moment where I threw up my hands and said, "What?" And then sat for about 5 seconds, thought about it, and just said, "Of course," because that's what Abercrombie does. In many ways, he's like the traditional mystery authors of the classic authors, that you have a mystery and they solve it and you see at the end, oh, I should have figured that out. Same thing here. The ending of this, I did not see coming, and it was brilliant, and it was the only way it could have ended. But what's even more brilliant about this book is The Trouble with Peace, which I haven't talked about yet, ends very well. And actually, there's a lot of finality to the end of the second book in this trilogy. So for about 100 pages of this last book in the trilogy, you don't know as a reader where it's going. You don't know which plot threads are going to go where and what's going to happen. But there were dozens of ways that Abercrombie could have taken the tale. In fact, I stopped at I was about 80 pages in, and I didn't know where the story was going to go, and I made a list, and I came up with like 14 different ideas of the ways that I thought Abercrombie could take the story. And of course, number 15 that I didn't write down is where the story went, and it was brilliant. I love The Wisdom of Crowds. It was just a fantastic conclusion to this trilogy and this 10 books in the First Law universe. Brilliant. Number 3, Before They Are Hanged. So this middle book of the First Law trilogy, in retrospect, for me is the moment that Abercrombie reveals to the reader what he's really all about. And what he is about is he is going to subvert your expectations as often as possible. There were times when I was reading this and I wasn't used to that aspect of his story where it felt just jarring. When you're used to certain tropes going certain directions and they go different directions, it's kind of shocking, but it's brilliant. And this book, much like Half the World, has my 2 favorite tropes. It has that fellowship trope and it has that quest trope. But this is a fellowship like I've never read before, and this is a quest that does not go how you expect it to go. And it's one of those that he shows you what he's all about. Abercrombie does not have middle book syndrome at all in this book, and I love where it set up the finale of this series. Before They Were Hanged is a great one, and I think I've seen some people rank this as their favorite Abercrombie book, and I wouldn't disagree with them. Number 2, The Last Argument of Kings. So I did not know that this book was divisive until I saw Mike talking about it on his channel when he gave a review a few weeks or months ago. Last Argument of Kings ends so well. I don't understand why people didn't like it. Actually, I do, because he does not wrap it up with a nice little pink bow on top. This does not end like other works of fantasy that you've read before. Because again, as he showed you through the trajectory of this series, he's going to subvert your expectations, and he does that all the way to the end. But the thing for me that I loved about the ending of this, much like The Dark Tower, when an author makes a bold choice at the end of a book, it makes me think about it so much more than those stories that end predictably, or the author takes the easy way out to please the readers or something like that. I love the ending of this book because I thought about it, and I thought it was just so bold. But when I reflect upon what I had read up to that point, I should have known that he was going to end this with a bold ending, and it wasn't going to be something that was going to be something familiar to me. So I loved The Last Argument of Kings. I immediately went into the standalones right after that. Number 1, The Trouble with Peace. When I reviewed The Trouble with Peace during my monthly wrap-up, July or August, I said there are no perfect books, but this one's pretty close, and I still stand by that. This book does everything on such a high level: plotting, pacing, character arcs, story. It has a big ending, really big ending, that has a lot of finality. But then at the very end, he reminds you, like, hey, reader, we're not done yet. It's just a little snippet. It's kind of the anti-middle book syndrome. A lot of middle books, you get that middle book or even a penultimate book of a book series. You'll get a cliffhanger that maybe excites you at first, but then makes you mad because you got to wait a year or two until the next installment comes out. Or you get that middle book that's just kind of staging things to set up the final book. This does none of that. It tells a brilliant story. It has a story arc, multiple character arcs. This is the book where, for me, I really connected with these characters in this second trilogy. And the plotting and pacing was, dare I say, perfect. I don't know if there are many perfect books out there, but The Trouble with Peace is pretty close. Okay, so that's my ranking. What did I get wrong? Tell me below. Let's discuss. But we are talking about art. This is all subjective. And don't forget, I love this author. I love these works. You do too. So let's be civil with one another. But if you like this video, please like and subscribe. Also, find me on Twitter and Goodreads. I'd love to interact with you there. As always, thank you for watching. Until next time, goodbye.